Welcome to Clarify It. Will the absence of diplomacy lead to an escalation of conflicts among superpowers, or will they sit down at the negotiation table? Is the European Union an independent global player, or does it merely follow Washington? How justified are the concerns about Russian influence on election outcomes in the United States and the European Union? And what role does the CIA play in the war? We will be discussing these questions. Today, our esteemed guest is a professor from Columbia University who contributed to the Polish economic transformation. He also advised the Slovenian and Estonian governments on the return to a market economy, particularly to Russian presidents Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. Today, he advises the UN Secretary General and is recognized as one of the most influential economists in the world. He has a close connection to the Czech Republic through his Czech wife, Dr. Sona Sachs. Our guest is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor, politicians from the European Union, for example from Poland, as well as Czech politicians, say that the security situation is the most serious since World War II. In your speeches, you emphasize the need to understand the historical context in making such strong statements. In your opinion, is the security situation in the world really the worst since World War II?
Well, it's very bad, and it can be improved dramatically if we understand the roots of this. Unfortunately, in Europe and in Ukraine, the roots start with the United States, not with President Putin. So there's a big misunderstanding in Europe of what has happened. This push by the US government for NATO to expand to Ukraine and to Georgia is the cause of a war that never should have happened, that was absolutely unnecessary, and that has created a grave security crisis for Europe. And the European leaders, unfortunately, not only misrepresent or misconstrue what's happening, but they aggravate the situation. Rather than saying we need to have a peaceful modus vivendi with Russia, they say we need to escalate because we're going to war. This is absolutely the wrong approach, and European leaders should know better.
You characterize current Europe as becoming too dependent on the United States and simply following Washington's lead. You also emphasize the complete collapse of diplomacy between the United States and Russia and the almost complete collapse of diplomacy between the United States and China. In the context of the absence of diplomacy, you warn of escalation that could lead to nuclear war. And you see the restoration of diplomacy between the United States, China and Russia as the highest priority for global peace. Do you see any indications from the named parties that they are moving towards restoring diplomacy?
Well, first, let me say that European leaders have said to me, the U.S. doesn't respect us. The U.S. treats us like children, is what one European leader said to me. My view was that Europe needs to have its self-respect, and it needs to say to the United States, we don't just blindly follow all your mistakes. So if the U.S. says NATO should enlarge, which is what George W. Bush Jr. pushed in 2008 against the objections of the European leaders at the time, such as Chancellor Merkel, Europe should stand up to the United States respectfully and say, no, we don't follow you right over the edge to World War III. We don't want a war on our continent. We don't want to be in war with Russia. Now, many European leaders claim, well, Russia attacks unprovoked. But this is absolutely false. The U.S. overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. Does anybody doubt that? It's caught on tape. The U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador planning the government after Yanukovych. It's on tape. Just listen to it. So in this context, the European leaders need to have some respect for Europe and not just to follow the U.S. blindly, as has been done. And shame on the Commission to basically represent NATO rather than represent Europe, because the European Commission's about Europe, it's not about NATO. So in this sense, I think that there is really a mistake that starts with Europe, because if European leaders said to the United States, you let us into this debacle, we don't want it, we don't want escalation, we want peace, we need to make a modus vivendi with Russia, it will happen, actually. Now, when it comes to the United States, unfortunately, this administration and the past one, Trump, so it's been almost 8 years of basically no diplomacy, and before that, Obama and his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, they weren't much at diplomacy, and before that it was George W. Bush, which was zero diplomacy, was war all the time. So we've been basically almost a quarter century now in the U.S. with no diplomacy. Actually, I can even take it back, because where was the diplomacy in 1999 when Bill Clinton bombed Belgrade for 78 days? Can you imagine the United States bombing Belgrade for 78 days? But that's exactly what happened. So Europe got trapped by its dependency, psychological and in security terms, on a U.S. that thought it runs the world. And this has created the instability. Is there hope? Well, first of all, there's always hope. If Europe would get its act together and think like Europe rather than like the United States, this would be a major step. Second, I don't know about the U.S., but at least Biden spoke with Xi Jinping in the last couple of days. At least they spoke. Biden has not spoken with Putin. Not once, as far as we know, since 2022, since the start of 2022. That's a shame. How could we have a world so dangerous and the two leaders aren't even talking to each other? So that's a disgrace. Of course, I don't think Biden's in very good shape. I hope that the Democrats run somebody else, although it's getting very, very late. You know, we shouldn't have an 81-year-old president who's not all with it, as far as I can see, claiming another term. That's a lot of drift. That's very dangerous. So my view is we need a new candidate of the Democratic Party. But before then, we need Biden to pick up the phone or to press his button and make a Zoom with President Putin and say, you know, we've got to back off. The rhetoric is out of control. The talk of war by Europeans is out of control. I don't know what they're thinking. You have a Latvian president tweeting, Russia must be destroyed. Are you kidding? This is absolutely out of control. Where are the grown-ups in Europe?
You participated in the Turkish Diplomatic Forum in Antalya. The same conference was attended by the Slovak Foreign Minister, who met with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. This led to a disruption of Czech-Slovak international relations. Tell us, should politicians engage with Russian representative or not?
You know, I'm married to a wonderful Czech woman for 44 years. And I'm not too happy about the Czech government attitude, which is don't talk, just escalate, go to war, no red lines. When the Slovak foreign minister met with the Russian foreign minister, My own view is bravo. That's what diplomacy is all about. Of course they should meet. Are you kidding? That's how we avoid war. All hats off to the foreign minister of Slovakia. Exactly the right thing. This is what diplomats do. They meet, they talk, they can disagree, they can find common approaches, they can identify areas of disagreement. But when the Czech government then comes and says, this is outrageous talking, well, you know something's seriously wrong with the view of the Czech Republic. I'm sorry to say it. It's a kind of a second home in some sense, but it's not right to say no diplomacy. It's not right to say don't meet. That is the path to destruction. Of course you meet. Of course you talk. And I met with the Slovak foreign minister, a very distinguished and honorable gentleman, and I could only congratulate him for that meeting. I also, in Antalya, met with the Foreign Minister Lavrov, whom I admire enormously, by the way. I think he's a superb foreign minister, one of the best in the world. And you have meetings. When you have disagreements, you need to meet. Otherwise, we kill each other. That can't be the goal.
Let's one more discuss your assessment of relations between the United States and Europe, where you say that Europe has become too dependent on the United States and follows Washington's lead. Is the European Union currently a global player, which is an ambition often emphasized by its representatives, or has the role different?
No, look, Europe, the European Union became an appendage of the United States. It became an appendage of NATO. We know that President von der Leyen wanted to be the head of NATO. You know, she saw the European Commission as a stepping stone to be the head of NATO. She faced opposition, so it's not going to happen. But how could anyone that's the head of the European Union aspire to be head of NATO? I would have thought it's completely the other way around. But she wanted to be head of NATO. That's sad. The European Union, once upon a time, was a union for economics and society. It wasn't an appendage of the US military alliance. It wasn't the same thing, but it has become that. And you look at now van der Leyen, you look at Borrell, they don't speak like diplomats. They don't even speak like European leaders. They speak like basically cheerleaders of the United States. And the United States is in a wrong state of mind because the United States idea is US hegemony, which is crazy. The US does not run the world, cannot run the world, must not dictate to the rest of the world because that's just leading to more war and more tensions. And yet Europe says, oh, no, it's the transatlantic alliance. That's the most vital alliance and so forth. Instead of Europe saying to the United States, look, you have to understand your approach of hegemony is threatening our security. That's what Europe should be saying to the United States. It could say it respectfully, but it could say it, but it doesn't say it at all right now.
Currently, we see on one side an economically deteriorating Europe, and on the other side, economically growing United States and China. What do you think about the future of Europe in a global context?
Well, it is said, and I think there's truth to it, that one of the United States' basic ideas was to prevent close economic relations between Germany and Russia. Germany and Russia have a kind of natural economic complementarity because Russia has vast natural resources. Germany is the center of Europe's industrial strength. Slovakia, Czech Republic, Austria, everybody depends on the health of the German industrial economy. But the United States, it is said, and I again think it's quite credible, acted for many, many years to try to prevent Germany and Russia from becoming more closely economically integrated. That's a U.S. tactic, which is always make divisions because, remember, the U.S. wants to keep its primacy and hegemony over Europe. Okay. But then came, of course, the decisive blow when the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And that rendered Europe completely dependent on very high-cost U.S. liquefied natural gas. And this is why Europe is in recession right now. This is absolutely clear. This action by the United States to sever the links between Europe and Russia threw Europe into recession. By the way, I don't think the situation in the United States is all that good. For the moment, the U.S. economy macroeconomically is okay, but our social divisions, our collapse of order in the U.S., our miserable politics is not very good. So I don't think that it's a matter to celebrate the U.S. economy. But what I would say is that all of this horrible distraction of war is leading to economic decline, worsening living standards, worsening social conditions, and, of course, growing danger of an expanded war.
This year, as a year of many elections in many states, the United States will elect a president and member states of the European Union will have election to the European Parliament. Many politicians fear election meddling by Russians through disinformation or various pressure groups. Do you think the influence of Russia in the United States in the European Union is such that it could fundamentally change the election outcome?
No, I don't think the problems in Europe have anything to do with Russian disinformation. The problems in Europe have to do with the fact that Europeans are fighting an American war, a proxy war, but an American war that is unpopular. They have to do with the fact that Europe is in recession because the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. They have to do with the fact that the public does not support this war. This is the mass media do, the politicians do, but you look at Europe's political class, look at the approval ratings, say, of Scholz, look at the approval ratings of Macron, look at the approval ratings of De Croo, look at any of the approval ratings in Western Europe right now. Everyone's unpopular because the situation's not good. You don't need Russian disinformation. It's just, this is local politics. People are not happy. They don't believe in what's happening. European leaders have become all about military increase, 3% of GDP, 4% of GDP, no red lines. We have to prepare for war. I can't believe this kind of talk in Europe. Where are the diplomats? It's just shocking. And so, of course, the public is unhappy about this. And these right-wing parties, so-called, they're the ones, ironically, saying, you know, we should not be at war with Russia. And the public saying, yeah, that makes sense. So the problem is European politics. The problem is not Russian disinformation. It's the same story in the United States. Biden does not win support for U.S. foreign policy. It is overwhelmingly rejected by the public. By the way, most of the American people don't want Biden to run again. They think he's too old. Even so, it's not even a matter of party. They just think this guy should not be running for president for another 4 years, for heaven's sake. So this is a problem of our politics. Our politicians are out of touch with what people want. They're not listening. And European politicians are not listening to the European public. They're listening to the United States. The U.S. Politicians are listening to our CIA and to our military-industrial complex. They're not listening to the American people. And so you don't need Russian disinformation for this. It's a perfectly plain, on the surface politics of Europe and the United States that account for what's happening.
You recently published an article titled "How the CIA Destabilizes the World." I quote, "The CIA has three basic problems: objectives, methods, and accountability." You also referred to a former CIA director, Pompeo, whose quote, "We lied, we chatted, we stole." This word has literally gone around the world. The current CIA chief, William Burns, served as the US ambassador to Russia in 2008, and available information suggests that he considered the push for NATO's expansion to Ukraine a serious mistake. What role do you think the CIA currently plays in the world?
Well, the problem with the CIA is that when it was created in 1947, it was created with two completely different missions. One mission was to provide intelligence, that is, understanding of the world, to the US president. That's a valid mission. And the other was covert operations to destabilize other countries. That built on the so-called OSS, the Office of Special Services of the US during World War II, where a covert behind the enemy lines operation against fascist Nazi Germany was carried out. But that approach of covert behind the enemy lines operations was instituted in the National Security Act of 1947. So the CIA was created with two completely different purposes. One, an intelligence agency. The second, a covert operations private army for the US president. That second activity has done untold damage for decades. The CIA assassinated leaders. The CIA has overthrown many, many governments. The CIA destabilizes governments. The CIA participated in the coup against Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine in February 2014, which is one of the reasons for this war in Ukraine. The problem is it's covert, meaning not that it's not known because you can figure out things, but it's denied. It's based on lies. If I say these things, the mainstream media say, Professor Sachs is telling lies, he's engaging in conspiracy theories and so on, where basically I'm explaining what happens, but because it's covert, well, then you can deny anything in the US government. And that is very destabilizing. Other countries don't like to have their governments overthrown by the US. The US has engaged in dozens and dozens and dozens of regime change operations. They are very destabilizing. They lead to prolonged wars. In 2012, as an example, President Obama ordered the CIA to overthrow the Syrian leader, Bashar al-Assad. I put that in the column of stupid ideas. Why is the US trying to overthrow the Syrian government? But let me just point out, it's a dozen years later. Bashar al-Assad is still in office, thank you, but it's been a dozen years of war. That's what the US does. So this is why I'm saying the CIA should be an intelligence agency. Fine, it should collect information, it should brief the president, it should make threat assessments, but it should not be a covert ops agency.
My last question. What role does the CIA play in the conflict in Ukraine and in its potential resolution now?
You know, we had a story in the New York Times that after the coup, the CIA set up several operations across Ukraine that it's been heavily involved with the Ukrainian government. This is in the New York Times, which is an inside job of the U.S. government, basically. So we were told that the CIA is extremely active. Do you think they explain it to us? Not exactly. Do you think that the Congress oversees this? Not at all. So to answer your question, we can't answer the question exactly. We know it's there. We even have it now, quote, documented by the New York Times itself, which receives information directly from the CIA and from the US government. So yes, of course, they're very active. But what are they doing? We don't know. That's a big part of the problem.
Professor Sachs, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.